Okay, guys, last lecture of the week, and it's a good one. It is Richard Nixon, which I know a lot of you have been asking for a long time. When are we going to learn about Richard Nixon? Today is your day. As we know, as most of us probably know, Richard Nixon doesn't have the best legacy, I guess you could say. He's made a lot of mistakes, but he's a really important figure for more than just his mistakes. So this lecture is going to be kind of broad in scope, and it's going to attempt to kind of cover a lot of his different policies, both in the United States domestically and abroad. Because remember, he is overseeing the end of Vietnam. This whole week, we've been focused on the Vietnam War. So some of you may be asking, why are we ending with Richard Nixon? And the reason that we're ending with Nixon is because the Vietnam War also ends with Richard Nixon. He kind of ends a lot of things, including his own presidency, which is also a big mistake. So let's get into it. Richard Nixon. Let's see. So if I could tell you kind of the most important feature of this man, I think it would be that he really cares what people think about him. Richard Nixon wants everyone to like him, and that really becomes his downfall. When we talk about Watergate in a little bit towards the end of this lecture, we're going to see that really the reason why he does these crimes, he commits these crimes and covers up all these scandals, is because he wants people to like him. He wants people to vote for him. And so this is something that is a common feeling that he has throughout his whole presidency. It guides a lot of his decision making, and again, in the end, it kind of leads to his downfall. So if we're going to borrow from literature from Miss Nelson, we would say that this is kind of his fatal flaw. He really wants people to like him, and so for that reason, when we're looking at his policies, we're going to see that he really attempts to play both sides. In terms of his domestic policy, he tries to pander to both Republicans and to Democrats because, again, he wants everybody to like him. Now, he is a Republican. He belongs to the Republican Party. But again, he kind of throws some gifts to the Democrats as well because even though he's a Republican, he wants the Democrats to also like him. And so when we're looking at his domestic policy, we kind of call him a centrist. And a centrist is somebody who kind of stays in the center, just like it sounds. So even though, again, he identifies with the Republican Party, and a lot of his policies are very Republican in nature, a lot of his domestic policies are kind of right down the center. So he's a centrist trying to pull in approval from both sides. So for the Republicans, he tries to give the states a lot more rights and authority. Remember, the Republican Party has always been a really strong supporter of state rights. They want the federal government to have limited power and the states to have more power. So the way Richard Nixon attempts to do this is by giving a lot of money to the states. Okay, this is called new federalism. So he gives a lot of money to the states, and he basically says, listen, you can use this money for whatever you want. Usually when the federal government gives money to the states, the federal government gets to decide at least a little bit on how the states use that money because it was theirs to give. But Richard Nixon says, I'm going to give you this money and you can do with it whatever you want. Okay? So that's what he gives to the Republicans. So what does he give to the Democrats? Well, he basically takes LBJ's Great Society. Remember, he takes over for LBJ. LBJ says, I'm done, I'm out. Richard Nixon's our next president. He basically takes LBJ's Great Society, all of those programs. Remember a couple weeks ago, you guys researched some of LBJ's Great Society War on Poverty programs that had to do with like education and food stamps and welfare, all those different programs to help the poor. For instance, he takes those and he expands them. Okay, so he actually relaxes the eligibility standards. He makes it easier for Americans to qualify for things like food stamps and for welfare and for child care subsidies, housing subsidies, things like that. He also increases, again, like I said, kind of like welfare programs, especially for single mothers. We're going to see in the 1960s, when we talk about culture next week, that there is a sharp increase in single motherhood. And so a lot of the programs that Nixon supports are aimed at helping those single moms kind of get through with their kids. He also tries to, this is an interesting one, he tries to guarantee what we call an annual income for Americans. And this is an idea that we still hear today. There was a presidential candidate who dropped off pretty early in the race recently, but was running for 2020, who had this same idea, basically that every American, if you're working in a job, you should receive a guaranteed income. So you can't make less than the guaranteed income. It's like a minimum wage, but it's a salary that all Americans would qualify for. That was actually an idea that Richard Nixon had all the way back in the 70s. And so we can see again through his domestic policies that he's trying to give a little bit to the Republicans and a little bit to the Democrats because he wants both sides to like him. Okay. He also does a lot for civil rights. We've talked a lot about civil rights in the 1960s, things that LBJ did, things that even Kennedy wanted to see done before he was assassinated. Nixon kind of continues the movement on largely through segregation of schools, right? And so we've seen that schools have been desegregated, but it's taken a really long time for that process to kind of unfold. So by the time that Nixon comes along, there are still a lot of schools that are segregated in the South. But we see some of the sharpest increases in desegregation in the school system during Nixon's presidency. It actually goes from 32 to 77% of Southern schools have African Americans there in their white schools during the Nixon presidency. And so there's a lot of work that's done there. He also pursues a policy called affirmative action, which you've probably heard that term thrown around. It's become a really controversial term, actually. But the initial purpose of affirmative action was to try to give African Americans and people of color kind of a fair opportunity to get jobs in occupations that were usually off limits to them. Okay, so jobs at certain companies, as lawyers, as doctors, some of these higher level positions where African Americans were largely excluded from for decades and decades and decades before. Basically, affirmative action said you have to have a certain percentage, a certain quota of African Americans hired in your firm, in your company, in order to meet this standard. So affirmative action, again, it's meaning to boost minority employment by establishing quotas or percentages that these companies and businesses had to follow in order to be in compliance with the federal government. Again, it's become kind of a controversial term. People in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, they feel very differently about affirmative action, but that was something that Nixon, when he was president, was trying to help African Americans succeed and move into these fields that they typically hadn't been involved in before that. He also appoints a new Supreme Court justice. His name is Warren Burger. He does a lot for civil rights as well, kind of good and kind of bad. For instance, he requires transportation for students in order to achieve school integration. Remember, you go to school, if you're in the public school system, you go to school kind of in your neighborhood. You go to your local school. But for African Americans, if you're living in a black community, and then the white schools are way out of town in the white housing developments or the white suburbs, it's hard for you to get there. So this Supreme Court case, it was called Swan versus Charlotte Board of Education, basically said we need to put African American kids on a school bus and bus them to the white schools in order to achieve real desegregation. But there were other Supreme Court cases that he kind of presided over, this justice, which actually kind of reinforced housing segregation in the public education system and kind of kept things the way they are. So he's kind of a mixed bag when we're looking at the Supreme Court. There was some good things that he decided, and then there were some things that actually ended up kind of hurting African Americans along the way as well. But Nixon is probably most remembered for, aside from Watergate, of course, his Cold War policy and his involvement with Vietnam. And so again, just like with his domestic policy, we see that overseas with his foreign policy, Nixon is attempting to play both sides, right? It's kind of hard to see where he lands. On one hand, he's heavily influenced by his Secretary of State. This guy's name is Henry Kissinger. You may have heard of him before, super famous. Kissinger, he is kind of very hard-lined, very aggressive, and so Richard Nixon is very influenced by him and kind of takes that on as well. And we see this as he attempts to basically undermine governments that don't agree or align with American economic interests, okay? So, for example, Richard Nixon was known for giving weapons to different revolutionary groups in Iran, in the Philippines, in South Africa. Basically, if he thought that there was a group out in the world that would be more beneficial for American economics if they were to be in power, he would try to give them weapons so that they would overthrow their government and then make more favorable economic terms with the United States. The best example of this is something called the Allende Affair, where basically the United States gives all of these weapons and all of this money to support this coup in Chile. Okay, and so you have this coup that basically outs the socialist leader. His name is Salvador Allende, which is why the affair is named after him. And so this is, again, another example of a really aggressive foreign policy that Richard Nixon employs in order to try to make more favorable terms around the world, kind of getting rid of socialist governments and installing in their place governments that are very pro-American. But on the other side of things, it seems like he's trying to also de-escalate Cold War tension, right? So on one hand, he's over kind of giving weapons to all of these coups and these groups in order to overthrow their governments. But over here, he's actually trying to de-escalate Cold War tension. So we see him, for instance, traveling to China in 1972, which had not been done before. China is a communist government, but he goes there in 1972 and he meets with Mao and basically kind of establishes a relationship with China. He does this again in 1972. He goes to the Soviet Union, actually, and he meets with the Soviet Premier Brezhnev and basically says, we are going to try to bring in a new era of coexistence. We're going to try to cooperate with one another in this era called détente. Okay. He also signs a treaty called SALT, where basically it's strategic arms limitation talks, where he's talking about bringing down the number of nuclear warheads that the United States owns and creates. So trying to de-escalate, bring down the arms race that we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks. So again, on one hand, really aggressive foreign policy, overthrowing governments, giving weapons to all of these revolutionary groups. But then over here, he's going to China, he's going to the Soviet Union, he's signing treaties to try to decrease the number of nuclear warheads that we have in order to try to cooperate more and bring down or de-escalate the tensions in the Cold War. Again, we see this in Vietnam. We remember, based off of what we've studied this week, that Americans have kind of turned against the Vietnam War. You guys have been listening to some music in the last couple of days that have expressed those sentiments. You have more college campuses, college kids that are protesting what they're hearing on the news, the draft, all these different aspects of the Vietnam War. It's kind of turned into a stalemate. There's no real forward progress, and so Americans are largely just kind of tired of fighting it. So remember, LBJ, he had announced that he was going to try to decrease the number of troops, but then he basically says, I'm not re-running for president, I don't want to be elected again, and so he leaves. When Nixon takes over, he kind of keeps that same message going, and he runs his campaign. He basically gets elected on saying, I'm going to get us out of the Vietnam War, and that's largely why he wins, is because, again, Americans don't want to fight this war anymore. And so when Nixon says, I'm going to get us out of here, Americans say, great, you're in, you're our president, get us out of here, okay? And so when he comes in, he's expected to kind of give his plan to get out of Vietnam. And he announces something called Vietnamization, okay? And this is the exact opposite of a term that we talked about earlier in the week, which was Americanization. Remember, Americanization was America's going to lead the way. America is going to be the one that does most of the fighting so that we can bring, freedom to Vietnam. Vietnamization is the opposite of that, where basically it says, okay, we've been fighting this war, it is your turn. We're passing the keys to the car over to the South Vietnamese. It's your turn now to fight this war for yourselves. We are gradually going to move out, and you are gradually going to move in and kind of fight this and win this for yourself. Okay, that's Nixon's plan. But again, Nixon plays both sides. So he's saying that to the American public. I'm getting you out. We are going to let Vietnam fight this for themselves. But then in 1970, he plans an invasion of Cambodia, which is basically located right above North Vietnam. And it had long been known that the North Vietnamese were getting supplies from Cambodia. There were these supply lines, these tunnels running through this area, and that's how Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese were getting the stuff that they needed. And so Richard Nixon thinks, if we can get rid of those supply lines, maybe we can win. Maybe we can actually start making forward progress and break this stalemate. So he invades Cambodia in 1970 in this attempt to break these supply lines, and it goes really bad. Not only does he not break the supply lines, but he basically destabilizes the country enough. The government collapses because of this invasion, and guess who takes over? The communists, right? And so not only does he not, end the Vietnam War by cutting off these supply lines, he accidentally creates another communist government, another communist country in its place. So this thing goes really bad. And you can imagine how Americans respond to this. Like, the protests just ramp up in the 1970s. And so you have more music, and you have more Americans, college students across the country who are just protesting the Vietnam War all the time. So the anti-war movement is picking up steam. In addition to that, there's a couple of other events that happen that fuel the anti-war movement and get more people against the war. For instance, in 1970 at Kent State University, there is a rally, there's a protest among college students, and some police officers fire into the crowd, and a couple of anti-war protesters, 4 college students, are killed at that rally. In 1971, there's another event called the Pentagon Papers. They're basically these classified documents that were released that shows basically that we had been involved in Vietnam all the way back from basically World War II. Remember we talked about how Kennedy had been putting troops early into Vietnam, just kind of keeping the peace? Well, all of those details come out in these Pentagon Papers, and Americans start thinking this is a conspiracy. This is a big plot to basically take over Vietnam, and they start questioning everything that they have been told about why they're over there. And so all of these different instances combined, right? The Pentagon Papers, Kent State, the Tet Offensive, which we talked about last time, Cambodia, all these things are working together, and Americans have just had enough. So in 1973, we signed something called the Paris Peace Agreement, which is our final withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam. It is what essentially ends the war in Vietnam for the United States. And so we leave, we exit the country. The Vietnamese take on fighting for this war, but again, they're just not ready to do that. We leave kind of abruptly, and they just don't have the resources in order to protect themselves. And so in 1975, the North Vietnamese, they launched kind of a final attack. In the South Vietnamese portion of the country, it falls to communism, and the peninsula, or the country, is united under Ho Chi Minh and the communist government. So this is actually, because of that, this is considered the only war that America has ever lost. And this is kind of a controversial statement. If you talk to Vietnam War vets, a lot of them will say, no, we didn't lose. The South Vietnamese lost. We were already out of there by the time, the North Vietnamese took over. But kind of as time has gone by, history has not looked upon this war favorably. Most people agree, most historians agree, that looking at the wins and losses, that this is a war that the United States clearly lost and would be our only one in our history. So all of those are parts of Richard Nixon's presidency. But again, what he is most known for is the Watergate scandal. And again, I talked about his fatal flaw. This man wants everybody to like him. He kind of plays both sides. And as the anti-war movement picks up in the 70s, Richard Nixon becomes more and more paranoid, because that hatred for the Vietnam War, it starts to get turned toward Nixon, right? People say, Nixon, you said you were going to get us out of this war. Why are we still in it? And so more and more people turn against Nixon, and that increases his paranoia and his desire to get people to approve of him. So he develops this enemies list, basically this secret list of people who he thought were his enemies, who were conspiring against him. And again, all of this is just kind of evidence of his growing paranoia. So in 1972, he's up for re-election. He's trying to get elected again, okay? He's running as a Republican. There's Democrats who are running against him. In June 1972, there's a break-in at the Democratic Party election office. So there's this office that's kind of running campaigns for the Democratic Party, and this office is located in Washington, D.C., in an apartment complex called the Watergate. Okay, that's where we get the name of the scandal. It's based on the location where the scandal took place, right? So there's this security guard, and he's just doing his job. He's bouncing around at night, he's got his flashlight, and he sees up in one of the apartments in this Watergate building that there's lights on, and there shouldn't be lights on, right? So he goes in to investigate, and he realizes that this apartment, this office, had been broken into. And so he calls it in, and they realize what it was. It's not just any office or any apartment, right? It's not like someone just broke into a house. This was a Democratic Party campaign headquarters. It's a big deal. And so a lot of confidential information in there. And so they start investigating. And eventually, even Congress takes over the investigation. You have newspapers like the Washington Post who are reporting on this. I mean, this is a really big deal. People want to know, like, who broke in here and who ordered them, who, kind of made them do this. And so eventually, once Congress gets kind of in the middle of this investigation, they start holding hearings, and they trace things all the way back to Nixon. And they realize that there were a bunch of tape recordings, different conversations that he had in his office, and they order Nixon to hand over those tape recordings, right? Because again, Nixon's super paranoid, so he tape recorded all the conversations that he had. And so once Congress finds this information, they order Nixon to turn them over. So they start listening to these tapes of all of these recorded conversations that Nixon had, and they realized that Nixon had actually authorized the payments. He basically paid off these people, these burglars that had broken into the Watergate, for their silence. Okay, so he kind of paid them off so that they could go away. He also, in those conversations, ordered the FBI to stop investigating the Watergate scandal so that he could hopefully, cover it up and never be found out or implicated for it. Okay, so all of this comes out. August 1974, the House recommends, no surprise, that Richard Nixon is impeached. Okay, now we just went through an impeachment trial. Remember, the president, in order to be removed from office, has to go through a trial. That's called impeachment. And then if impeachment is successful, then it is referred to the Senate to remove the president. So it's a two-part process that includes both houses of the U.S. Congress. So the House of Representatives plays a role, and the Senate plays a role. Okay, so the House says, we're going to impeach you, Richard Nixon, and this is a no-brainer. Like, everybody knows that this guy lied, he tried to cover up his crimes, and so it's a no-brainer that he's going to get removed. And so rather than face impeachment, Nixon basically says, I'm out of here, right? So he actually resigns. He's our only president in history who has resigned the office, right? We've had a lot of presidents who have ended their terms early, by being assassinated, for instance, like Abraham Lincoln, or LBJ decides, I'm not going to run for a second term. That's fairly normal to say, I'm not going to run for another term. But to resign in the middle of your presidency, in the middle of your term, that is rare, and only Richard Nixon does it. And again, the reason he does it is because he knows that that he's definitely going to get impeached for the scandal that happened at Watergate. So again, not such a great legacy. But despite that, there was a lot done in his few years in office that made him definitely an influential president outside of the crimes that he committed. So, anyways, last lecture of the week. We made it through to Friday. We are halfway done with the fourth quarter, if you can believe it or not. I don't know about you, but I am ready for the summer and for the school year to come to a close, but I miss you guys a lot. Again, I hope you're washing your hands, and I miss you a ton. Stay safe. Talk to you soon.